watch a lot of movies, and one thing I've noticed that's very common with older films is how much they used to let their actors look ugly. Nowadays, every actor looks ready to pose for a magazine at any given point in the movie, even if they're going through the worst moment of their lives. This is not entirely true of indie films, but even in lower budget films, it's still the case that actors rarely ever look unkempt. Today, I'm going to talk about why that is. One of the main reasons modern films lose me is in a way they just don't feel real anymore. Not just with using CGI for everything instead of practical effects, which I generally don't take much issue with if the CGI is good, but about locations. I, of course, don't need to buy that everything that happened in a film really happened, but it's harder to buy into a film's universe and be invested in the story if the stuff being shown on screen feels removed from the actors. So when you blend the effects well, when a scene is lit properly and the production makes the space feel lived in, it feels like the universe of the film is grounded in its own reality, instead of making the viewer aware that what they're watching is fake. The word to describe when the elements of the film feel real like that is tactile, as they aid the verisimilitude of the story. Even though you can't touch the stuff you're seeing inside the film, it feels like you can, it feels real. A lot of movies nowadays struggle with that feeling of tangibility, with a clear example being the live-action Moana. When that trailer came out, everyone was talking about how fake everything looked. And the main reason why, the main reason most big-budget blockbusters look fake like that, is the use of soft lighting and backlighting. I'll talk about soft lighting later, but backlighting is used mostly because it helps the post-production process, especially with CGI-heavy movies, since it creates sharper edges between the actors and their background, making it easier to change the background if necessary without having to fiddle too much with the masking of the subject. It's also why every single scene in The Lion King 2019 is backlit, even though it is fully CGI, since it's especially hard having to mask fur and hair, which is also probably why they straightened Moana's hair in the live-action remake instead of letting it be curly like it was in the animated film. It's fascinating how the animated Moana looks way more real than the live-action because it actually has purposeful lighting and set pieces, and everything on screen feels and looks alive. So the less real is more real somehow. Like the uncanny valley of trying to emulate reality instead of embracing the unrealistic presentation of the animation. Which is why the live-action Moana's one-to-one shot recreations look bland and awful, since they took away all the color in favor of looking realistic, which is confusing, as what's the point of making a film with a giant singing crab look realistic? Obviously the Moana film was probably shot mostly in front of a green or blue screen, so this kind of lighting makes sense, but even films shot on real locations suffer from this problem. One example is Ang Lee's Gemini Man. I have no idea why, maybe this just was always his vision for how the film should look, but every scene shot outside is lit from the back, which makes the background look fake every time. People will probably hate me for using this other example, but the same can be said about Sam Raimi's Send Help. Probably the main reason I didn't like that film is how everything looked fake. They shot the film on a real location, on a real beach, in a real island, but both the uninteresting production design that left the backgrounds feeling extremely empty and lifeless, and the way most scenes are lit from the back, and have very soft lighting made it feel to me like the film was all shot in front of a green screen. But the issue isn't just the backlighting. One thing you might not realize if you're younger than 25 is that films of the time weren't supposed to be watched how we watched them. I don't mean on streaming, I mean films and shows were made with the expectation that they would be seen in low quality. You can see this with a TV show like Friends, which was shot to be watched in a 4:3 aspect ratio, which you can see from old recordings of VHSs and DVDs of the time the show was airing that are around on YouTube, but in 2026 you can open HBO Max or, buy the full collection in 4K and watch Friends in 4K HDR in 16:9 aspect ratio. This is because a show like Friends was shot on film, and so we can get new 4K scans of the show, and it'll look fantastic, but it'll cause problems. Like how everyone has already pointed out the weird holes in the walls of the set, presumably to move cameras or props around off-screen, which is also the case even for Simpsons when it was moved to Disney+. Recently I was watching A Nightmare on Elm Street on my 4K Blu-ray, and I was watching with audio commentary on, where Wes Craven ended up talking about how amazing it looked, how vivid the colors looked. However, that audio commentary was recorded in the 90s, not long after New Nightmare came out, and they were praising the VHS transfer of the film. saying it was the best the film had ever looked. Sometimes people like me, especially around my age, who grew up with films being so easily accessible and always living in a world where DVDs were the poorest quality available for everything we watched, usually getting Blu-rays or streaming films with much higher quality than ever thought possible back in the 90s and before, we forget that films from that era weren't expected to be watched like this, with such a level of visual detail. The reason I mention this is because even though older films mostly look better to us, if they had the capability of shooting and seeing that much detail in their films back in the day, they might have tried to hide better the blemishes and imperfections that we see nowadays as being part of why older films look so good. Nowadays we have much better cameras than we had decades ago, so they capture more detail, which is a double-edged sword in terms of how it changes the way films look. On one hand, because the level of detail is higher, cameras can capture subtleties a lot better. Actors can act more subtly and their performance will still shine through. And the same is true for makeup and production design. Back then, they had to make a lot of visuals exaggerated, make certain things more pronounced, because they needed to be conveyed on low-resolution screens. It's the same principle for how theater productions work. You need to act and your makeup needs to be visible, even for the person in the last row of seats in the theater. It's a bit of a lost art to have overly dramatic performances and exaggerated makeup and costumes. A performance like Shelley Duvall's in The Shining just wouldn't really exist in the 2020s, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We have different sensibilities nowadays, and we appreciate subtle performances a lot more. So not only is there more of an expectation of subtlety of the visual part of films, but there's also the fact that with better cameras, with more detail being visible for the viewer, a lot of films have tried to hide the imperfections in actors' faces, which is why a lot of scenes are lit with soft lighting. Actors being vain is not exactly new, but it is kinda crazy how much they're expected to look beautiful in films where they're going through the worst time of their lives. It makes me think of Jurassic World Rebirth and how pristine Scarlett Johansson looks, even as she's in the hot as hell region of the equator in the middle of the jungle, but she's not sweating a lot or anything. She looks like she's ready to walk down a runway. I'm not sure if the issue is that actors have gotten worse in terms of vanity or if more detail meant they're more aware of how they look on camera, but the reality is, and this is the whole thing that gave me the idea to make this video, is that actors don't ever look like they're actually affected by the world they're supposed to be inhabiting, and you never, ever see actors sweating anymore. Take Jurassic World Rebirth again. The most you see on Scarlett Johansson is a few tiny drops of water. Now compare that to a film like Predator or a show like Lost or even the original Jurassic Park. They're drenched in sweat and you can see on their skin the amount of stuff these characters have been through. This is what I mean by tactile. Even if you want to show how modern films can do this well, we can talk about The Batman by Matt Reeves, shot by the brilliant Greg Fraser. Everything about the Batman looks extremely grimy and disgusting, reflecting the tone and feel of Gotham. Batman's suit is full of scratches and indents, which make you feel like Batman has actually been fighting battles for a while. Bruce's face when he takes off the mask with the black eyeshadow running down his face, leaving his face smudged and dirty, is a beautiful visual because it helps make it feel more real. Like Bruce doesn't stop being Batman when he takes off the mask. The paint around the eyes doesn't just magically disappear because we can't have our actor look anything less than perfect. It is also worth mentioning that the Batman was shot digitally. It's not the case simply that films shot on film are better looking than films shot digitally. For example, A Cure for Wellness, a film that's also shot on digital, looks phenomenal and doesn't try to hide the imperfections in actors' faces and actually uses them to build the atmosphere and visual style of the film. One thing you notice in most MCU films is how much characters take off their masks and helmets to show their faces, which makes sense with how much money these actors are paid. So the filmmakers want to get bang for their buck and have them on screen as much as possible. But it also makes it seem weird how little they're affected by their surroundings. If you compare Avengers Infinity War to the first Iron Man, it's crazy how few battle scars there are on Tony's armor, which obviously can be justified in universe by his nanotech, but it takes away from the tangibility. Again, it's probably because it's easier and cheaper to do it that way, even when it comes to maintaining continuity between shots. Instead of adding details to the CGI suits, leave them without details so it's easier to render. It wouldn't really be an issue with films that don't need to rush their VFX teams to pump them out, Like how the suit in The Amazing Spider-Man 2 looks gorgeous in every shot, full of wrinkles and flapping around, because the VFX of that film are all purposeful and took their time to be made. It is also worth mentioning the way the practical suits in superhero films allowed for much cooler effects like the destroyed suits in Raimi's Spider-Man films, compared to MCU Spider-Man who rarely has any damage taken to his suits, which hopefully will change with Brand New Day, fingers crossed. But, more so than a lot of what I've said, the biggest reason films nowadays don't seem to look as good as they used to is because the filmmakers are scared of contrast. Take Send Help, for example. I talked about how that film is shot and how it bugs me, but if you were to turn up the contrast, suddenly the film looks way better. The characters' skins look redder, making the sun seem harsher, as it should considering they're on a deserted island. Suddenly, backgrounds that seem empty feel like they have a lot more depth due to the different levels of shadows. So, while before I said Send Help is lit badly, I actually think the problem is the color grading. I'm not exactly sure why this sort of thing is the case though, since even watching these films on Dolby Vision or HDR, the colors are muted. I've heard people saying the problem with modern films is that they're made for HDR, so when watching on an SDR screen the colors are muted, but I have a Dolby Vision TV and an HDR monitor, and I still have that issue when watching stuff. My theory is that because most media is now watched on streaming services, and said streaming services have low bitrate, which makes blacks look blocky, a lot of media is scared of having blacks in their stuff, opting instead for more muted colors so the blacks are grays, and their films don't look as cheap on streaming. As well as what I said about detail, because more contrast means noticing more detail on screen, which goes back to what I said about actors needing to look pretty. But hey, that's just a theory. But truly, when I figured out that the issue was contrast, my mind was blown, because you can apply it to so many things and not change anything else about the film to improve the look and make it feel more tactile. Obviously, it doesn't apply to every film. Moana still looks bad with more contrast because it was lit entirely from the back, so having higher contrast just makes the subject look way too dark. But a lot of stuff improves with a higher contrast and looks way more colorful. The problem is that all of these issues I mentioned aren't informed by an actual creative vision. There are films and TV shows that are gray and ugly and overcast, and it aids the atmosphere of the story being told, like The Road from 2009, but something like Infinity War has no business looking this muted. So, in conclusion, I think the biggest issue is how companies like Disney crunch their VFX artists, as their films are made by committee and not with an artistic vision in mind, thus forcing the films to look worse, which is an effect that trickles down onto lower budget films that want to look like big budget blockbusters. People complain about movies and TV shows being too dark nowadays, but it's a symptom of the same problem, as just adding a bit of contrast makes things a lot easier to make out in the dark, as well as the issues with streaming compression which make dark scenes very hard to see. I really hope big budget films become more purposeful with their visuals, so they go back to feeling more alive. Thankfully, most low budget and indie films still have a distinct visual style, as they're made with an artistic vision and not by committee, so it's not the end of tactile visual storytelling. It's just yet another symptom of film becoming a way to make money instead of being what it is meant to be, art, meant to express feelings and experiences in a unified vision.